Spring, 1944. Across the fields of Normandy, German tank crews peered through their sights with grim confidence. They faced Shermans, lighter, thinner, and often outgunned compared to their Tigers and Panthers. To the German commanders, victory seemed certain. But then, something strange happened. The Shermans never fought alone. They moved like parts of a living machine, one unit covering another, flanking with uncanny timing, striking from unexpected angles. It was as though the American tanks could anticipate German moves before they happened. The truth lay inside every Sherman, a small black box humming with unseen power. It wasn't a gun or an armor plate. It was an FM radio. For the first time in history, tanks weren't just iron beasts. They were voices, connected across the battlefield. German Panzers fought in silence, relying on flags, messengers, or shouted orders in the chaos of battle. The Sherman crews, by contrast, spoke freely, warning of ambushes, calling for artillery, or maneuvering in perfect sync. At first, German commanders dismissed the difference. They believed armor thickness and firepower would always win the day. But battle after battle told a different story. Shermans, though vulnerable alone, became lethal in groups, their coordination overwhelming even the mightiest Tiger. To German eyes, it was like fighting not against individual tanks, but against a single coordinated organism. One American veteran later explained, "The radio was our strongest weapon. It meant we never fought blind. Crews could call for reinforcements the moment they made contact, or retreat and regroup before the enemy even realized." This invisible advantage rewrote the rules of armored warfare. What the Sherman lacked in brute strength, it made up for in intelligence and unity, and that hidden edge would prove decisive on the road to Berlin. If you're fascinated by these untold secrets of WWII, make sure to like, share, and subscribe as we uncover more stories. To understand why the Sherman's radio mattered so much, we have to look at its opponent. The German Tiger and Panther were engineering marvels, tanks built like fortresses, armed with guns capable of shredding a Sherman at over a mile. Crews inside these machines believed they commanded the ultimate weapon of armored war. In duels of gun against gun, armor against armor, the Germans expected no contest. But there was a flaw hidden in their perfection: silence. German tanks lacked radios for every vehicle. In most panzer units, only the platoon leader carried one, leaving the rest to rely on hand signals or colored flags. On the fast-moving battlefield, those signals were often missed, misunderstood, or impossible to see under smoke and fire. By the time orders reached the back of a column, the front had already been destroyed. The Sherman, by contrast, spoke with one voice. A platoon could shift formations in seconds, execute ambushes, or scatter and regroup without ever breaking rhythm. German crews often reported frustration, watching what looked like a chaotic swarm of Shermans suddenly align into a coordinated strike. To them, it seemed almost supernatural. One Tiger commander recalled, "We fired, we killed one, but 3 more came from the flank before we could react." What he didn't realize was that Sherman crews were calling out every shot, every movement, guiding one another like hunters surrounding prey. The Germans tried to adapt. They ordered more radios, but by then resources were stretched thin. Fuel shortages, Allied bombing, and the sheer complexity of their tanks left little room for change. The silent giants continued to roll into battle, powerful, intimidating, but deaf to the world around them. Meanwhile, Shermans multiplied. What they lacked in armor, they gained in numbers and unity. And in the clash of doctrine, brute force versus communication, the tide of battle slowly began to turn. The secret weapon inside every Sherman wasn't about strength. It was about something Germany never mastered: the ability to fight as one. By 1944, the Sherman had evolved into more than just a tank. It had become a node in the world's first true battlefield network. For the first time in history, armored warfare wasn't just about steel clashing with steel. It was about information flowing faster than the enemy could react. Every Sherman carried an FM radio that linked not just tanks to tanks, but tanks to infantry, artillery, and even aircraft overhead. A platoon commander could request artillery fire in seconds, then roll forward under a curtain of shells. An infantry squad pinned by machine guns could call for a Sherman to pivot and blast the nest into silence. Even fighter bombers circling above could be directed to strike precisely where armor needed support. This seamless web of communication turned every battle into a choreographed assault. The Germans, despite their mechanical superiority, fought as isolated units. A Tiger might dominate a duel, but it was blind to the larger picture. A Sherman platoon, connected by radio, could maneuver like a single organism, luring, flanking, and overwhelming opponents. One American tanker described it bluntly. "We didn't fight as one tank. We fought as 5, 10, sometimes 50 tanks talking to each other. The Germans never stood a chance once we closed in." For German crews, the frustration was palpable. Reports from the Eastern and Western fronts spoke of Shermans that seemed to know where the Panzers were before contact was made. In reality, it was simply communication at work. Spotters relayed positions, infantry passed along sightings, and Shermans coordinated strikes with uncanny precision. This wasn't brute strength, it was efficiency. Where the Germans invested in armor thickness and bigger guns, the Americans invested in networks and adaptability. And in modern war, that was the deadlier weapon. By the time the Allies pushed deeper into occupied Europe, Sherman units were operating like mobile command centers. Each tank's radio amplified not just its own firepower, but the combined strength of the entire Allied machine. The battlefield had changed forever. For the first time, the victor wasn't the tank that hit hardest. It was the one that could hear, speak, and act faster than anyone else. To the Germans, the battlefield often felt like chaos. Tiger and Panther crews relied on shouted orders, hand signals, or runners carrying messages across exploding terrain. Their radios, when installed, were often unreliable, reserved only for command tanks. The vast majority of Panzers fought deaf and mute, unable to call for reinforcements or warn allies of danger. This silence was deadly. A lone Tiger might smash through a handful of Shermans in open ground, but without coordination, it became a stationary target the moment flanking maneuvers began. Allied crews didn't need to outgun it, they just needed to talk. A platoon leader could simply say, "2 tanks swing wide left, the rest draw its fire," and within moments, the mighty German machine was surrounded. Sherman formations, by contrast, sounded like a symphony. Overlapping voices filled the airwaves. Tank commanders reporting enemy sightings, infantry units calling in for cover, artillery officers adjusting fire. It was noisy, imperfect, sometimes even chaotic, but it worked. Every movement was reinforced, every threat quickly answered, every opportunity exploited. German veterans later admitted they often felt like they were fighting not against individual Shermans, but against a single coordinated force. One Panther commander recalled bitterly, "It was as if the Americans always knew our blind spots. We fought alone. They fought together." The effect wasn't only tactical, it was psychological. German crews, confident in their engineering, were unnerved by how quickly their advantages melted away. Superior armor meant little when 2 Shermans distracted from the front, and a third delivered a fatal shot to the side. Firepower was wasted if the enemy always knew where to strike next. For the Allies, this was proof that the battlefield had entered a new era. Radios made the Sherman not just a tank, but a multiplier of force. Each unit's strength was magnified through connection, turning what might have been an even fight into a crushing advantage. It was here, in this contrast between silence and symphony, that the true invincibility of the Sherman was revealed. Not in armor, not in guns, but in voices carried through static, stitching an army together in real time. On the fields of Normandy in June 1944, German tank crews believed they held the edge. Their Tigers and Panthers, bristling with 75mm and 88mm cannons, had shredded Soviet armor on the Eastern Front. Many expected the same in France, that the lightly armed Sherman would crumble in the face of superior steel. But the first major encounters told a different story. When Shermans rolled forward, they rarely came alone. A single platoon moved like a hunting pack, guided by constant chatter over the airwaves. One Sherman spotted a Panther at the edge of a hedgerow and reported instantly. Within seconds, flanking units adjusted their approach, artillery support was requested, and infantry moved to screen vulnerable angles. The Panther's advantage in armor and firepower was undeniable, yet it was suddenly overwhelmed from three sides. German crews were stunned by how fast the Americans reacted. While a Tiger commander waited for a runner to pass orders along the line, Sherman units had already repositioned. While German gunners shouted across the din of battle, American tankers exchanged crisp, coordinated directions that cut through the chaos. The result was decisive. Tanks that should have dominated were often destroyed before they could even bring their cannons to bear. Witnesses described the shock vividly. German infantrymen reported watching entire panzer units fall apart against smaller numbers of Shermans, not because of firepower, but because of flawless coordination. A veteran later confessed, "They moved as though controlled by one hand. We were always too slow, too alone." For Allied crews, those early battles were proof that their secret weapon worked. They didn't need to match German armor pound for pound. They only needed to work together, to communicate faster than the enemy could react. Radios allowed them to do just that, and it changed the rhythm of battle forever. That summer, the myth of German invincibility cracked. Panzers still inspired dread, but now it was mixed with something new: fear. Because no matter how thick their armor, no matter how powerful their guns, they could not fight an army that thought, moved, and struck as one. For Sherman crews, the radio was more than a tool. It was a shield that saved lives. In traditional warfare, tank units often suffered devastating ambushes. A hidden gun could knock out a lead vehicle, block the column, and trap the rest in a deadly kill zone. German tactics thrived on this principle, relying on concealment and powerful first strikes. But with radios, the Americans rewrote the rules. The moment a Sherman spotted a threat, the warning traveled instantly. A lone gunner could whisper into his microphone and alert an entire battalion. The ambush that once would have destroyed half a unit was now broken before it began. Tanks fanned out, artillery zeroed in, and infantry advanced cautiously under coordinated cover. A single call crackling through the headset often meant the difference between disaster and survival. To the Germans, this invisible shield was infuriating. Carefully laid traps lost their sting because the element of surprise evaporated the moment contact was made. Veteran panzer officers, who had once relied on precise ambushes, found themselves outmaneuvered time and again, forced into chaotic retreats as their positions were exposed and encircled. For the Allies, the psychological comfort was enormous. Crews who might otherwise have felt isolated inside steel coffins now knew they were never truly alone. Every tank was a pair of eyes for the others. Every commander had a dozen allies at his back. Fear turned into confidence, and confidence turned into aggression. German accounts after the war admitted as much. One officer noted bitterly, "We could destroy one Sherman, but we never destroyed one. When you fired at one, 5 more appeared." They always knew. That constant awareness gave the Sherman an advantage far greater than thicker armor could ever provide. Radios created a battlefield web, a living shield woven from shared information. While German crews were trapped inside isolated fortresses, American crews were bound together by invisible threads. It was here, in this unseen defense, that the Sherman became invincible. Not because bullets bounced off its hull, but because no ambush could silence a voice carried over the air. For years, German propaganda painted the panzer divisions as unstoppable steel beasts. The Tiger, with its thick armor and devastating gun, was showcased as the pinnacle of armored warfare. German soldiers believed it, Allied troops feared it, and civilians whispered about it in awe. But on the battlefields of Europe, that myth began to crumble, not under the weight of bigger guns, but through the hum of radio signals inside the Sherman. When Allied units advanced, their movements were synchronized with an ease the Germans couldn't match. One Sherman didn't charge a Tiger head-on. Instead, platoons worked together like hunters circling prey. A single commander gave orders, flankers moved wide, artillery shifted position, and infantry closed gaps, all while the German crew was still debating its next move. In countless encounters, Panzers found themselves blindsided. A Tiger might destroy one Sherman in a frontal duel, only to be hit seconds later from the side by two more it never saw coming. Panther crews, trained to exploit their superior optics and firepower, were often stunned when Shermans appeared where no enemy should have been, directed by radioed orders relaying terrain updates from tanks miles away. The effect rippled beyond the battlefield. German morale, once anchored in the belief that their machines were unmatched, faltered. Soldiers began to whisper that American tanks fought like a single organism, impossible to corner, impossible to trick. The very symbol of German strength, the Panzer, was now seen stumbling against lighter, weaker Shermans that should never have won on paper. For Allied crews, each victory chipped away at fear. Confidence replaced hesitation. Crews who once dreaded facing Tigers now saw them as vulnerable targets, provided they stayed connected, followed orders, and trusted their network. The myth of invincibility had shifted sides, and as the Sherman's reputation grew, so too did its psychological dominance. German commanders realized too late that the battlefield had changed. The fight was no longer about who had the thicker armor or longer barrel. It was about who could act first, adapt faster, and strike as one. The Panzer legend had been broken, not by brute strength, but by voices carried across static. When the war ended in 1945, the world was quick to celebrate the weapons that had defined the battlefield. The Thunderbolt fighter, the B-29 bomber, the Tiger tank, and the Sherman itself. Yet, hidden behind the headlines, one of the most transformative tools of the conflict remained almost invisible: the radio inside every Sherman. For the first time in history, armored warfare was not about individual machines, but about networks. Radios had turned fragile tanks into a united force, allowing ordinary crews to outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately defeat some of the most formidable armored designs ever built. The Sherman, mocked by some as underpowered, had proven that communication could be a weapon as decisive as steel or firepower. This lesson didn't end with the war. In the decades that followed, every modern army embraced battlefield communication as the cornerstone of mechanized warfare. From Korea to the Gulf, radios became as essential as armor plating. The invisible threads of coordination that once gave the Sherman its edge became standard practice across the globe. For Germany, the failure was a haunting reminder that brilliance in engineering could not compensate for outdated doctrine. Their tanks had been masterpieces of design, but they fought as scattered giants, never able to harness their collective strength. For the Allies, the victory was proof that war favored those who could think beyond the weapon itself, who could see not just the tank, but the network it belonged to. Today, when historians ask how the Sherman managed to stand against the Tiger and Panther, the answer isn't hidden in blueprints or armor thickness. It lies in the static-filled chatter that once echoed across Europe, in the calm voices of young commanders guiding each other through fire and smoke. That was the Sherman's secret. That was the weapon that made it invincible. In the end, the legacy of the Sherman is not one of raw power, but of connection. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the gun in your hands, but the voice in your ear, carrying the strength of an army through the crackle of radio waves.